happening. You're trying to figure out ultimately what is.
It's still a mystery as to why it took them. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Primetime Crime Live. I'm your host, Lauren Conlon, along with my co-host, Jarrett Ferrantino. Hey, Jarrett.
Good evening, Lauren. How are you?
I'm good. I'm running around, but I'm good. I'm a little sweaty right now. Oh, and I'm whacking myself in the face. So it's going to be a great show. We have a lot to cover tonight. I don't mean to make light of things. We have two very amazing guests. One of them you know very well, Brian Fitzgibbons of USPA, and also our boots on the ground. But also we have Tad DiBiase. Now, Tad is known as the no body homicide guy, and he's a former federal prosecutor who's dedicated his career to cracking some of the toughest cases, homicides where there's no body. So he's written a comprehensive book on the subject titled No Body Homicide Cases, and he's just widely regarded as the leading expert in no body homicide cases. So we're just really excited to have him here sharing his experiences. And I want to make it clear, I'm not, and Jarrett's not trying to imply anything about Nikki, but we're just trying to explore all options. So,
no, and quickly before we bring Tad in, we've been getting a lot of questions about this. Is it possible to move forward if she's never found, for example? And some questions about the ag assault charges. So I think Tad's specialty, I've done a lot of stuff in my career. I have not done a no body homicide. So Tad is the recognized expert. I'm really honored and excited to talk with him personally and professionally. But
yes. And
but
Brian,
I just think it's important that this has been the question we're getting most. So I thought it would be really good. And you had a relationship and have been on Nancy Grace with Tad, I think.
I was going to say, Brian reminded me, and I was like, oh my gosh, we need to get Tad. Like, I'm like idiot, Lauren. So I'm also very excited. And just for those watching that might not be familiar with Nikki's case, quickly, Nikki McCain, or Nikki Cheng Saelee McCain, she is a missing mom, a mom of four, and it's this happened in the Redding, California area, and we made a very comprehensive timeline, and I'm going to shout out to Kathy, who's helped me immensely with this timeline. It's been amazing to work with her, but there's been a lot of just strange occurrences with Nikki's her husband, her estranged husband, after she went missing. And as you all well know, there was a domestic violence incident that occurred allegedly, and this was set to go to a jury trial, and then Nikki disappeared. So without further ado, I'm going to bring in our guests, Brian and Tad. Hey, guys.
Hey, Lauren. Hey, Jarrett.
Well, I feel underdressed at this point. Brian's in a jacket, Tad's in a tie. I'm like this casual retired prosecutor guy. Well, that's
good. You're great. You're great.
Brand. And sorry I'm late. I missed the Primetime Crime live part. I thought, this is just being recorded, right? It's not actually live.
No,
so I apologize.
I should have told you that. I'm so sorry. I thought I did, but I realized I send out so many of these emails. I need to just make a better spiel. Usually I'm more concerned with the browser because people are like, I can't use StreamYard. So
no pressure, Tad. No pressure. There's zero room for mistakes on this show.
Well, when I did look, I saw Lauren's face and I thought, this is live. That's why she's wondering where I am. So I apologize for probably causing needless sweat. And hello to you, Brian. It's nice to see you again, too.
Nice to see you again, Ted.
So quickly, Brian, do you want to just kick us off with what's been going on in California lately with Nikki's case?
Yeah. So to that point, there has not been a whole lot of substantive developments in Nikki's case. At least that I'm aware of. There was certainly I don't know what we'd call it, but a cause for excitement in the search for Nikki the other day when what appeared to be human remains were found in Clear Creek. But the coroner quickly determined that these were animal remains. And that, by the way, is not the first time that this has happened in the search for Nikki.
Yeah.
And I do want to, as in a way of maybe an intro for Tad, one of the reasons that I thought it would be so great for all of us to talk here is to provide some perspective on these cases, right? And I think Tad's expertise speaks directly to that. Nikki went missing in May. It was 5 months ago, almost to the day. Today's the 16th, 16th into the 17th. 5 months ago to the day is when Nikki went missing. And in the grand scheme of things, that may not be a whole lot of time, when we're considering a no body homicide case. So, great to join you here tonight. Looking forward to answering some questions that come in from the live chat as well.
Thanks, Brian. So Tad, in your experience, I mean, what is 5 months? And I know that you are familiar with Nikki's case. Can you give some general thoughts and what is the average time here, if there is one?
Sure. I think Brian hit the nail on the head that even though this could end up being a no-body case, the most important part now is to try and find Nikki, whether we find Nikki alive, which hopefully we do, although I think, to be honest, that's unlikely, or find her body, because 5 months is not that long. There are many, many no-body murder cases where you're talking about years and years that go by. And even though I have spent probably the last, now getting close to 20 years working with police and prosecutors on no-body cases, and I talk about how you can make a case without a body, the main thing I say to police and prosecutors when they're looking at a case, whether it's been a week, 5 months, a year, 2 years, is it's better to have the body. That is always going to be a better case. So when you're talking just 5 months out, the focus has to be on, can we find the body? And in looking at no body murder cases, one of the things that struck me when I first wrote my book back in 2014 is when you either do find the body, which in the cases that I profile is after the case has gone to trial, or when the defendant talks about where he disposed of the body, it is almost always in a location familiar to that suspect. So the police in this case should be focusing on what are the areas that are familiar to our suspect, which in this case is her estranged husband, and what can we do to best search those locations. But as I said, the focus now should still remain on, can we find Nikki?
I think, Tad, one of the things, first of all, it's a pleasure to see you, and I'm familiar with your work. I have done a lot of homicide cases. I have not personally done a no-body case. I can imagine and appreciate how difficult that is. I think what our viewers and listeners should appreciate is not only does the body answer the question of what happened to our victim and where were they found, it's a treasure trove of information that could then be turned into an application to the law. You could get into intent. You can get into DNA. You can get into time of death, things of that nature, that on a no body case, not only is the open question of where's the body, oftentimes on a no body case, you don't know the manner of death. You don't know, there's no physical evidence under the fingernails of a body. So many things come with the discovery of a body that's left just hanging out there in a no-body case. So I can't imagine how difficult the first time you had to do this was.
Yeah, so I've actually only tried one case myself. I've consulted on about 50, but your point is completely valid, Jared, because when you don't have the body, you don't know where the murder happened. You don't know how the murder happened, and you don't know when the murder happened. Now, in many no-body murder cases, the window of when something happened can be very wide. It can be many days, it can be weeks, it can be months before someone says, oh yeah, this person is missing. In this case, one of the advantages, the time frame is very, very small, right? We know basically 12 or so hours we have good suspicion of something happened to her then, and she went off the grid at that point. And that is helpful, but it still means in a normal case, when you find a body, I was a homicide prosecutor in DC, so a lot of my cases were over drug territory or they were disputes, and you'd find the body in the street. Well, okay, there's only so many people who could have done it in the street. And it's not likely to be a guy who's now living in Iowa, right? It's likely to be a guy who's living on Iowa Avenue in DC. And that's not the case when you don't have the body. Your pool of suspects just expands infinitely. And that may not be the case here, where I think we do have a strong suspect, but you always have in the back of your mind, could it have been someone else? Could she have been, walking home because she had a fight? Could she have been hitchhiking? All of these things you start to go through. And when you don't have the body, you have such a wider net that you have to cast in order to answer these questions, because ordinarily the body answers these questions. And when you don't have them, you have all of these unanswered questions.
So Tad, let me ask you this. Oftentimes you work with the discovery of the body backwards. Okay. In a case generally like this, okay, would you take your suspect and start looking at behavioral changes, motive and opportunity intent of that particular person and start working back? I hate to say like you start the investigation at the suspect, but with no body, you got to start somewhere. And do you reverse engineer that person's life?
Yeah, I think what you do is you actually start with the victim, because one of the things I caution against is you don't want to have that tunnel vision, which you can have if you say, I think it was this guy. You can have a good suspect, and the numbers tell you it's going to be someone they're in a relationship with. Something like 54% of no body murder cases are what we would call domestic homicides. Husband kills wife, ex-husband kills ex-wife, boyfriend kills lover or kills girlfriend. It's all of these. Parent kills child. So while it is smart to start with the percentages, I think when you're looking at it, you start with the victim first and you say, who is my victim? Who's my victim likely to have come in contact with? Where was my victim last seen? Where was her cell phone last seen? Where was her pocketbook? Where was her car? All things that here we have some information about, including her car. Very interestingly, we know was 45 minutes to an hour away. So I think you start with that. And on top of that, though, you're also at the same time going to be looking at, well, who are my logical suspects? Because I not only want to start with them, I want to start with them quickly, right? Because there's that show, The First 48, where they say within the first 48 hours, if you don't get information in the case, your chances of solving it go down like 50%. Well, I later spoke to someone who was a producer on that show, and she said she made that statistic up, which I was like, oh my God, I've quoted that.
Oh my God.
She's like, it just felt right. And I'm like, oh, great. Love TV, right?
It does. It does sound right. 48 hours, 50% close, right?
And it does. Yeah. It honestly does. I mean, we all know this, that the leads you get early on are often very important and very powerful. So you don't want to ignore your suspects, because you may not have another opportunity to talk to them again, to get evidence from them, to go to their house, to get a search warrant. So, but I do think you start with your victim and you start working out from there.
Yes, I think there's so much frustration, Tad, because there is one person that would have motive that is, I guess, considered a suspect, because everybody's considered a suspect until she's found. But there's certain things that just don't make sense. I saw something the other day in a Facebook group from someone that knows Nikki fairly well. And there was a mention that she possibly took an Uber the night that she was last seen with her husband's mother, or something like that. And this friend was like, well, she didn't even have the Uber app. And I think the frustration is we know that law enforcement can't share anything with us, but it's like, we can help. And I think that's where I'm frustrated. We have some people in the chat asking about the geo profiler that we brought in, Doug McGregor.
Right.
And nothing, they don't even cost money. I mean, he literally said he will take the reward money when she's found and split it with the family. And so it's frustrating, because there are other ways, there are other avenues. And I guess I don't know enough about this department or whatever to speak to that, but it's frustrating.
Yeah, and I understand that frustration very well, having kind of been on both sides, have been an advocate for the families, but I don't independently investigate cases. But also I work for a police department now. I've worked with police for a long time, so I get that reluctance. But But I also say too that one of the things in a no body murder case is because they're so unique, there's not that many of them. You have to, as an investigator, be more open to getting help from other places. I've had police detectives use psychics, which I do not believe in. I think it's silly. But the reason they do it is because then on the stand later, they can't say they didn't try to do anything to solve the case. They tried to do everything. They didn't reject any sort of help. And I have faced it very rarely. You know, my services are free. As you all know, I consult on these cases. I work with police regularly. I don't charge anything. So sometimes you get what you pay for. But it has surprised me in a handful of cases when the police have said, "Oh, we're not interested in your help." And I'm kind of like, why? I wouldn't come on this show again if I started helping. I don't talk to the press about those cases. But it is frustrating as an outsider. And your point about the Uber app is really a valid one. That is a data point. And I don't know whether the police know that or not, but that is a quick, unique data point for the police to know, well, I'm not going to waste my time looking at Uber drivers because she didn't even have the app. And it's something, of course, they can confirm with Uber. They can figure out, did this person have this app? Was she registered? And they can still do that without having that information, but it's much better to have that information and to back check it by going to Uber and saying, can you confirm whether you have this? Think of how much time you've saved rather than, well, I need to get a subpoena to Uber and get the information. And those are the types of things where you have to let people help you if they're willing to do so.
Well, Tad, I've been a part of some of those investigations, and there is that politics of prosecution. There's that pride. There's a lot of egos. But at the same time, let this be like an ad for Tad. It's basically, there's an enriching experience in bringing, like I would say to my teams, like I brought the no body homicide guy in. Like there's like, I'd use you as a way to build up my case to say, we brought this guy. He literally wrote the book on this. You're educating other prosecutors out there that continue to do this kind of work. Like there is an enrichment and an education that comes from bringing in people like yourself, people like Doug. But we both know, I think we all four of us know, Brian certainly has dealt with this. There is tremendous ego and pride and territorial pissing matches that go on.
Yeah, and that's unfortunately probably doubly true with law enforcement. And the thing I try to tell folks is you really have to take advantage of people who have a particular expertise. And I'm not the smartest guy. I wasn't the best prosecutor, but I do think I have this weird niche expertise on something, and someone like Brian has that expertise in finding missing people, and someone like Doug McGregor has that expertise, and you're crazy not to try and exploit that, where I'm not going to be able to be a child homicide expert prosecutor or DNA. I had DNA in my cases. I'm nowhere near, especially now. I've been out of the game as a prosecutor since 2007. But there are this one little narrow thing that I can help you on. And I will say, as I mentioned earlier, I've consulted on about 50 cases, and I can count on one hand how many times departments have said no. It's very rare. But I don't call up departments and say, hey, I'm happy to help. I usually tell the family, call them, and I wait for them to call me. But I got a call about a case in Georgia that I'm going to hopefully be looking into. And that's always exciting that, people keep saying, you don't charge anything. Like, you can hear them saying, you moron. But, the police departments and things often can't pay. And I also, because of my day job, I can't accept money for things like that. But so you're sort of getting free expertise, and that's generally pretty rare.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of police officers and just investigators and just people pushing back on podcasters and journalists specifically. And this is a new thing where podcasters and journalists get involved with these cases. And a lot of these guys are a little bit older and they're set in their ways and they're like, no, no, no. And I just want to shake them and be like, you don't understand. It's not about you. It really isn't. I don't pretend to know as much as any of you guys, but I know my strengths and I know where I can help. But Brian, do you want to speak to Doug at all or about Doug?
Yeah, I'll share in the frustration that Doug and his team have not been brought on to help. I think that that's a no-brainer because it goes beyond just the geographic profiling. He's got, crime data analysts, human trackers that track movements and things like that, and forensic psychologists. It's a multidisciplinary team. So I share in everybody's frustration there. I will say, however, that, looking at this in the perspective of time, right, that for those of us who have been intimately involved in the case, following the case on a daily basis, the public that's been a part of the searches and in the Facebook group, time seems to be going slow, minute to minute, day to day, right? Whereas when you back out and say, this could be a no body homicide case, and it may take quite a bit of time. So the last thing we want to do, as a private investigative entity or as the public, is do anything that's going to jeopardize the investigation. So that could be illegally searching private lands, whether it's a person's house, doing things to create evidence being destroyed, right? So you don't know what type of landmines you're stepping on. So we're in a delicate phase here where public's frustration is high and their activities may not be fruitful, and haven't been fruitful.
Yep. And let me ask you guys this, and I just want to say this out loud, and I'm not trying to blame anybody or point fingers, but it's going to sound like I am. I just mean you have an estranged husband who was arrested and charged with domestic violence. He was not convicted. You have the fact that his wife disappeared shortly before she was set to testify against him. And then you have the fact that after all this, multiple fires were set on his property or family property. And you guys are telling me that's not probable cause for any type of arrest or search warrant to take his phone, take his family's phone, search through that. I guess I'm a little confused here at why all
of those factors would factor into the probable cause cocktail there. So yes, the answer to your question is certainly those things could be considered in establishing probable cause for a search. Those things, and I'm sure other things they may have, but not one of those in a vacuum or definitively is the answer or get you probable cause for an arrest. The difficulty here is, I think, there's just these open questions about that 12-hour time span that Tad referenced. These things that have happened after are certainly relevant and worth considering and may be extremely relevant as things clarify. But there's that 12-hour window that we don't know what they have. We don't know whose phones they've seized already. We don't know what GPS data they have. We don't know what information could have been pulled from Nikki's vehicle when it was recovered. If you know all of that and what was going on in those 12 hours, that coupled with all of the things you just referenced, Lauren, are huge pieces of a puzzle and can be used to get a warrant.
I guess I feel like people in town would be talking if, police and law enforcement rolled up to Tyler's property, her husband's property, and they'd be like, yeah, there's clearly a search going on, because you would see it happening. And I don't think that's happened. And I feel like there's probably a lot of stuff they could uncover. I mean, even with the fires, it's not adding up to me, I guess. I'm having trouble. And I think I understand law enforcement. I know they have a really hard job to do. And I know that they are overworked, underpaid. I know that. So I feel for them, but also it's just, that makes sense, but I'm still not satisfied.
Brian, weren't there warrants early on though of relatives in the areas too, and we don't know what was grabbed at those searches?
Like a cousin or
anecdotally, and I shouldn't say anecdotally, but there were some Facebook posts that showed one of his cousin's vehicles being removed from his property on the rancheria. And there were multiple search warrants executed just about a month after Nikki went missing. Now, nothing has been disclosed on what was found, what the search warrants were in specific relation to. We believe it was in relation to Nikki's case, but it could have been other things as well. There were charges that came from that unrelated to Nikki.
And I will say, in every case that I've ever worked on that had media before, an arrest was made or before the trial, there's always something I will read in the case file, because I generally get the entire case file if I'm working on a case. There's always things in there that did not come out to the public. And I think all of us would agree the police generally have more information than they let on to the public for strategic reasons and because they're doing more behind the scenes. So I do think that is important to say. I suspect even in this case, the fact that there's not an arrest doesn't mean that they have more evidence. They may be deciding, once we arrest someone, depending on the jurisdiction, and I certainly don't know California, speedy trial clock may start ticking. And that means, we got to do certain things. And we know we can't get DNA for 6 months. We can't get the cell tower information we need for a certain amount of time. So we're not going to make that arrest now. We're going to wait. In DC, that was not really a problem because there was not really a speedy trial clock, and people would sometimes stay in jail for years before trial. But I'm not as familiar with, California, if that's a concern, that they don't want to jump the gun and arrest quickly, and all of a sudden 3 months later they're at trial.
That's a good point.
To that point, Tad, I'll add, just having been in Reading and spoken with a number of folks there in relation to the case, Tyler's represented by who's considered to be one of the best criminal defense attorneys in the area. So I know that the general vibe is that they want to have their I's dotted and T's crossed prior to anything happening here. This isn't a scenario where he's got a public defender assigned to him.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Or worse, nobody assigned to him. And they think, when we arrest him, we can talk to him again. That's not likely to occur here. You're not going to get another shot at an interrogation when you arrest him. You could try. I'd have to think about that. Probably not in this case because of the Fifth Amendment right or Sixth Amendment right to counsel. But that's likely not to be the case here.
Right, and he's already represented, so you're not going to get anything out of him. But I think Tad and Brian and Lauren too, like one thing I've noticed, Tad, you made a good point, and it's certainly true that obviously we don't know everything the police know. But one of the new phenomena I'm noticing in these cases, certainly in Kohlberger and in Delphi, the public, what's kept from the public, even as the cases proceed to trial, really, like if you look at Kohlberger and Delphi, a lot of information that is typically public before trial has been kept under wraps.
Yes.
From the prying eyes of the press and everybody else. That seems to be a unique phenomenon. Like for us, like I've had cases where, yes, in the investigatory phase, things are kept under wraps. You very rarely seal things after an arrest. But once it's going forward, I mean, everything's out there.
It's a good point because a lot of jurisdictions have open discovery. And so often the defense will strategically put things out to try and get ready to spin it at trial or to lessen the shock when it comes out. And so I think that's definitely a good point, Jarrett, that in a lot of these high profile cases, and maybe it is a reaction to podcasters and shows and the much greater interest in true crime than there was 15 years ago, 20 years ago, that they feel like maybe we should not be putting out all this information. And I get that as a prosecutor, maybe, but a prosecutor is also it's a public prosecutor, right? You're not a private prosecutor. There is some obligation to let the community be reassured, yeah, we have the right person. You don't want to pollute a jury pool, but you also want to make folks know, no, this is the right person that's being prosecuted. And you can often do that by showing the evidence that you have, showing your hand a little bit.
Have you consulted on a case that's similar to this one?
Ooh, that is a good question. I will say there is a case, and I generally never speak about my cases, but this case is one that I have in the past been given permission to speak about, and is a missing Native American woman in Montana. That is very similar. Someone who had a lot of connections to the community, had a child, went missing, young woman. She was younger than Nikki in this case. Very high profile, lots of interest. There has not been an arrest made in the case. The one difference in that case, though, is there's one very good suspect, an ex-boyfriend, but there's also a couple of other suspects who are also interesting, for lack of a better term. I don't think we've seen that here. I think most of the focus has been on the one suspect. I haven't seen a lot of speculation about other people. So in that way, it's a little dissimilar, but not. It was the similarities are, young, very attractive female, mother, had a lot of ties to the community, is not someone who is running away, had a very close-knit family, and very high profile from day one, because that's not a lot of no-body murder cases don't get any publicity until it starts to come out the person is missing, or until it goes to trial. This case is kind of unique in that the publicity came right away, that people kind of knew, and her family knew she's missing, and that doesn't make sense. This is not someone who should be missing. 4 young kids. It just didn't make sense.
Yeah, I'll just correct you though, because the publicity, it was Nancy essentially, and maybe one Dateline article, and local news covered it a few times, but it really stopped. But you're right.
Famous, so that's
but Nancy was huge. I mean, I think that it was so important and so awesome that Nancy covered it, and I think that's why people were, I don't want to say excited, but they were hopeful that it would get more coverage. And it's weird, and I think a lot of people believe, and I tend to agree, that it's because of Sherry Papini, and this is the same area as Sherry Papini. If you're not familiar, she faked her kidnapping.
Yeah, I remember the case, absolutely, and that's a shame if that's the case. And I guess I thought it had gotten more coverage because I had been following it, from being on with the two of you on Nancy Grace, and I just kept up with it over time and thought, oh, well, I'm reading about it, so others must be. But I think you've made a good point that it's probably not hit the national conscious in the same way. And if that's why, that's a shame, because you can't let one case of someone who lied about something affect all these other cases, particularly when we have so many missing women throughout the country. Obviously, not all of them have been murdered, but a significantly high number of them have been. It'd be terrible to let that be the reason why these cases aren't covered. That's a shame.
I know. And so the woman in Montana, what you're telling us right now is that she still hasn't been found, and there are still no arrests that have been made.
No, in that case, has probably about 4 years old now at this point.
Right,
and that's not
hope.
I know.
Give us some.
Lauren wanted an example of a case that you prosecuted into nobody. There was a conviction. So
yeah, well, here's the good news. If there's any good news in all of this sadness, is when the cases go to trial. So there's been about 608 cases since the early 1800s in the U.S., no body murders that have gone to trial. The conviction rate is 87%. And that seems incredibly counterintuitive, right? Because I mean, I suspect Jared didn't have an 87% conviction rate. I know I did. Maybe he did. Maybe he had higher. But
Those records are sealed, Tad.
yeah, exactly. So that is hot. The murder convictions generally, which is the highest conviction rate, run about 70-71%.
Right.
So you're talking even higher than that. And the reason for that is the cases that go to trial are, number one, the strongest cases. And number two, as I mentioned earlier, 54% are domestic. They tend to have an obvious suspect, right? It's pretty rare, but not unheard of, to have just a stranger on stranger, nobody murder case, because most of the time, if you kill someone who's a stranger, you're not going to spend a lot of time getting rid of the body, trying to cover it up, because no one's going to suspect it's you, right? You know, you don't know this person, and you know no one's going to be able to put the two of you together other than maybe forensically. So at trial, the success rate is actually very high. And I think that surprises people a lot. And what it says is the challenge, of course, is getting to trial. That's the difficult part. So we are in the hard part now, getting to arrest and then getting to trial. And of course, getting to arrest is the hardest part, because once you have an arrest, you almost always go to trial. And most jurisdictions say, if you're going to make an arrest, you got to have a better than 50% chance of winning guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, which is, something Jared and I had to labor under. You had to really be sure that you were going to win before you even arrested someone. Even though it's only probable cause for arrest, most jurisdictions and most district attorneys are saying, no, you got to be better. We're not going to just arrest someone on probable cause in a murder case if we don't think we can win.
And Tad, that conversation, like that investigatory process is tedious and brutal.
Yes.
But that conversation of whether to move forward or not, it's got to be something, like in a no-body case. Now, the ones you're talking about, like a stranger situation, would you typically have a confession and no body? Because I can't imagine where you're in a situation where you have a stranger with no real connection, no body. I mean, do you have somebody who's come in or just basically given it up or to confess to somebody else?
I think what I found in looking at all these cases, nobody murder cases are generally made one of three ways. The first sort of quantum of evidence, and the best, is DNA. I'm sorry, for what I'll call forensic evidence. It can be DNA. It can be cell tower records. It can be video surveillance, CCTV, some type of indisputable forensic evidence. The second way is confession to friends and family. And I include in that jailhouse informants, snitches, whatever you want to call them. At some point, the defendant tells somebody else. It may be his next girlfriend, right? Because he brags about it and says, don't you do this because you'll end up like my ass girlfriend, or I, killed her ass and got rid of her. And then the third way is confession to the police. Because most nobody murder cases, you don't have a witness, you don't have an ear witness, you don't have an eyewitness. You tend to have evidence those three ways. And that's true even for the stranger cases. Now, stranger cases, I would say, are often confession to friends and family, where someone tells someone else about it because they feel more certain they're going to get away with it, right? Because they're strangers. If I killed my wife, I'm not going to necessarily confess to it because I'm already a suspect if she's found dead. But if it's some random person in another state, I might be more likely to confess to it. And I think you see that more commonly in stranger on stranger cases.
There have been reports, and they could be rumors, but there have been reports that some people have been bragging about helping and this and that. Is it possible that law enforcement could zero in on, let's say, an accomplice or an alleged accomplice? Could they set their sights on that person? And I don't want to, could they offer them something to make them talk, or to, I'm thinking about this because I'm thinking about a no body homicide in my head where the person was convicted. And the first case that came up for me is Little Harmony Montgomery, which is actually out of my hometown of Manchester, New Hampshire. And she was killed by her father, and he dumped her body somewhere, and he won't tell where it is. But his girlfriend told on him
Yes.
for a deal, so she wouldn't get, or so she would get like whatever 3 years or something like that. I mean, I'm hoping that they're doing something like that as well, because if
Yes.
I'm seeing this in New York City, I'm sure the police in Shasta County are seeing the same thing.
Yeah, that's very common. In fact, in a case that's only 5 months old, as I said, I tell the police, focus on finding the body. The longer you go, though, without finding the body means the less likelihood you're going to find the body or get forensic evidence, right? In Nikki's case right now, we have no idea where it happened, right? It doesn't seem like it happened in the shared home. Doesn't seem to have happened in her car. So the likelihood of forensic evidence starts to get smaller as we go on with time. Finding the body seems to get smaller. Then the focus is at that point on people, right? Because I said forensic evidence is number one, confession to friends and family, and confession to police. Well, you're not going to interview the police and say, did anyone confess to you? You're going to go to the friends and family and start talking to people. That is one of the best ways in a no-body murder case, particularly one that is older, a true cold case, which is not yet, to find that evidence is talk to people. Because, and this is astonishing to me, and I know Jared and probably Brian know this, you'd be shocked at what people confess to, that sometimes people brag about it, because a lot of these people who are doing these no-body murders are domestic violence people. They're abusers, domestic abusers, and they're all about control. And this is the ultimate sign of control, that not only did I, kill that biatch, pardon my French, but I got rid of her too.
Right. And got away with it.
I got away with it. And the family doesn't know where she is. And it's a big FU to all of them. That is very common. And those are the types of guys, because it's generally guys, who brag about it later and talk to their next girlfriend about it. Don't end up like her, because look at what I did to the last one. You see that pretty commonly.
Yeah, I want to go up just for some questions.
Just before you say, I have one that's 54 years old, no body, and it fits that fact pattern, by the way. I'm gonna talk to you offline.
Yeah, absolutely.
I had one that remains unsolved, but it fits that fact pattern.
That's crazy. Sorry, this chat is super wild tonight. I'm like trying to figure out what the heck is going on. But Kevin had a question. I think we've hopefully answered it at this point. I'm going way back up, but he asked, is it possible to solve a case without a body? I mean, yes. Tad can, I mean,
Kevin, I think, buy my book, buddy. Come on.
There you go. And I will have links and everything to your book in the chat. And then there was one more I wanted to post. What happens when law enforcement fail to preserve evidence?
Yeah, that's a big problem, particularly, you have some of these older, colder missing persons cases where the evidence is now gone. If you haven't preserved, really, and Jarrett knows this, DNA came in like the 90s, basically the early 90s. So you have a ton of cases where you may have evidence from before then that you could test for DNA, except if you've gotten rid of it. And a lot of departments get rid of evidence, particularly, rape kits, DNA samples, all of those things, they start getting rid of it. If you don't have that evidence, you're at a huge disadvantage, because the way DNA forensically has moved forward, it's just incredible. And I try to keep up with it, but because I'm not in that life every day, I don't feel like I have as good a grasp on it as I used to. And the way they can now take small portions of unknown DNA and build a profile of almost exactly what the person looks like. I mean, these incredible advances, but if you don't have anything to test, it doesn't matter.
I think too, Tad, to answer that question even further, evidence often leads to additional evidence. So if something was failed to be preserved, you could end up in a situation where the subsequent evidence is either never discovered or ends up being suppressed because you can't build that connection. I mean, your case could potentially go to hell.
Yep. By not having that. Yep. And that's why in a lot of cold cases, they spend time going back through the evidence to see what can we possibly test. And that, in many cases, has become a very fertile way of getting additional evidence.
Can we fast forward and let's pretend that it's this time next year and that Nikki has been missing for over a year and a half and Shasta County wants to pull you in? Tad, where do you start? And let's say this is the progress that was made.
Sure.
What do you do first?
I start the same way every time. I say, you have to give me your entire case file. Put it on a flash drive, email it to me, mail it to me if it's hard copies, whatever it is, I want everything. And they say, well, you don't want all the body camera footage of interviews, do you? Yes, I do. You don't want all the recorded things we did. You don't want all the crime scene photos. No, send it all to me. And then I go through it and I prepare a pretty standard report that I do that has kind of separate sections. And then I do a very big to-do list. I was sort of famous for my to-do list as a prosecutor because I would sit on my ass in my office and order my detectives to do stuff. Here, check off my little to-do list. And then I give them a report on the case and then talk to them about where I think their case is at. Are they way away from an arrest? Are they close to an arrest and maybe need one thing? Are they a very strong case? Or as I said one time in a jurisdiction, I said, I'm going to move to your jurisdiction. I'm going to join your DA's office and I'm going to try this case because it is that strong. It's ridiculous. Your DA is not going forward. So I try to give them a sense as to where their case is and what else they need. Generally, most of the cases, I would say, fall in the category of either being strong and ready to go forward or maybe needing one or two more things. That seems to be where the cases fall.
Have you ever had an experience or a time where maybe law enforcement wasn't proud of their investigation and they didn't want to turn everything over to you because they didn't want to be scrutinized?
I definitely have had that happen once where I felt in Illinois one time where they did not want to share anything with me. What I'll tell you is a little bit more common is you will have a case that they bring to me and they'll say, yeah, the previous people didn't do a good job on this. And again, this has nothing to do with Nikki's case at all. Right. It's just saying there are occasions where they say the prior folks did not do a good job. And now I got it, dumped on my desk. It's a cold case for me. I got assigned to the squad. They give the rookies, the crappy cases. And so then we'll start working the case up that way. That's not uncommon. I will say overall, for the most part, in the almost 20 years I've been doing this, 50 cases I've consulted on, I am almost always incredibly impressed by the amount of work people have put in, by how they've captured the work, how they've recorded it, how they've kept careful notes and preserved evidence. That to me is really the rule, not the exception. There are times where I look and say, oh, this wasn't done very well before. And the new detectives agree. And I think that's why they reach out to me, because they're not afraid to ask for help. Right. A good detective should never be afraid to ask for help. It's like, oh, would you not go to the FBI if they had some expertise? Of course you would. So you have to be open to those, those different things that Brian can offer, I can offer, Doug McGregor can offer.
Yeah. I mean, and maybe just thinking out loud here, maybe Shasta County wasn't necessarily ready to turn over an entire case file.
Yes.
Right.
I get that. I get that. They're reluctant. They're like, who's this guy? Is he going to go on,
And I don't even know if it's that. I don't even know if it's that. Maybe it just wasn't so buttoned up. Maybe they're like, oh crap, people are looking at this. I gotta do something. I mean, and Brian, I don't know if you are the closest to this case out of anybody, and you don't even have the full case file, right?
No.
Yeah.
No, that's correct. And what I would say is, my inclination is always to think that if a department doesn't want to engage a group like Doug's, it's either because they're a lot closer than we can imagine, and they don't want anything to disrupt the case that they're building, right? So they're under strict orders from the DA to not bring anybody else in, or they're farther away than we think they are. Yep. And that that's where the pride might come in. Tad, I had a question I had a question for you, Tad. I had a chance to, and by the way, for anybody listening who's interested, to go to Tad's website, has an incredible amount of data on there. And I had a chance in preparation for the show to review some of those cases that you have listed. He has a very extensive document on there that details no body homicide cases all the way back into the early 1800s. And, you know, I cherry picked a few, and the Marion Fay case, the Tamara Banks case in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which was very similar to this one, where Tammy Banks had a protective order filed against her husband that didn't show up for a hearing. These cases were, led to convictions. But of these recent cases where that forensic evidence is at play, is that what you think is the straw that breaks the camel's back on these things? Is there a commonality with these cases that drag on for a couple of years of what the final push is before an arrest is made?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think what you find, Brian, in these cases is what you've pointed out, where you have these so-called triggering events, right? You have something of, why would this guy want to kill her outside of, marital difficulties or getting divorced or whatever, which I don't know that to be the case here, but you have a clear court case where now that court case was dropped, right? We all know that the DA could not go forward on the case. So you have this clear triggering thing. You have this clear motivation. You have a very strong suspect. What pushes it over the edge? And I think it varies from case to case. But again, I think I fall back to one of those three areas. It's either going to be some type of forensic evidence, or more likely, or possible confession to friends and family. I don't think in this case a confession to police is likely the way it's played out. But I think those two are the ones that tend to kickstart a case that's maybe been dormant for a while or hasn't had much progress for a while. And then the third one, of course, is finding the body. Anytime I've been involved in a case, and I've been involved in a handful early on, and then they find the body, complete game changer. I worked on a case in Missouri where they actually had already found the body, but it had been missing for a long time. Once they found the body, the whole concept of the case completely changed, because it just drew the defendant in so strongly. They had cell tower records that showed where he was, and they found the body near that location of the phone. So that really just changes the complexion of the case significantly. But you're right. The longer the case goes on without something like that, the harder it can be, because if we're a year and a half from now or a year from now, and we have, which is a year and a half out from when she disappeared, if we have the same kind of evidence that we all know about and haven't had anything else, I still don't think we have a case. I mean, I agree with Jarrett. What you described earlier, Lauren, is perfectly appropriate for search warrants. It is not. If they came to me with just this evidence and said, do we have enough for arrest? I'd be like, oh God, no, we're not. We're not close based on this. Now, my hope is, as Brian has said, they have more, and I suspect they do. Mm-hmm. But there's not enough in the public domain right now to say, yeah, you got enough for an arrest.
Totally agree. I think I was more thinking a search warrant.
Warrant, yes. Yeah, I agree there. I think there is.
Right? I thought they do have enough for a search warrant. Well, so when would you come into a case, Tad? What is a long enough time period with no movement, no nothing? When do you come in?
Oh, at any time. I've come in, within weeks. I've come in years later. I've come in only for trial. Sometimes I'll meet just with the prosecutors. So I have no time limit when I come in. Obviously, I'd rather be involved early on, because there are certain things you see in no body murder cases. You see evidence of cleaning up. So I very quickly say to the police, go to Walmart, go to any place where you can buy bleach, rubber gloves, cleaning equipment, saws, anywhere you can get that stuff. Take your suspect's photo and show every cashier, do you remember this guy coming in? Do you remember? Did you sell this? Can we get subpoenas for his credit card to see whether he purchased this stuff? These are the types of things you see over and over. I could list out 5 or 6 things, and one of them is what we were just talking about, a triggering event. I'm about to go to trial because I'm on trial for assault, and if I get rid of this person, it's the one person who has to come to trial in order for me to get convicted, and now they're gone, and I'm not going to get convicted of that crime. If he has indeed murdered her, he's never getting convicted for that crime. I believe the DA when they say they don't have enough. I know on Nancy's show at one point we talked about excited utterances, and there are ways to make these cases, but if they don't have that, they don't have that. And I suspect here they don't have it, because
that was one thing, Tad, we talked about. Like, in a sense, they have more in that case because Nikki did make a statement that she was assaulted by her husband. She did. The injuries were photographed.
Yes, I remember that.
The statements were made in the context of her medical treatment, which is an exception to hearsay, as you know. So, in a sense, they have a case that can be made for the assault. Right. The question is, do you take your shot if the investigation into her disappearance is still very, very hot and active? I know there was a lot of push and pull on the decision to pull that case, but the reality is she knows more than we do right now. If they're moving forward on a homicide prosecution, maybe it was better to pull it at that point.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think you have to make that balance. But you also have to say at the end of the day, how much is someone going to get? Now, that I will say that case was a particularly horrific assault. It was not your typical assault where husband punches wife, not acceptable. But that's a very different case than what we were talking about here, where I believe she was kind of, detained or held, and a lot of things going on there. It was not your typical assault case, as I recall.
Right. Yeah, you're correct.
Yep.
You brought up a really good point, Tad, about maybe tracking some store locations, like you said, a Walmart or a Home Depot, or, and if they don't have a suspect's phone per se, I wonder if that's happening or if that has happened. Law enforcement just going to show photos and saying, hey, was this guy here? Was this guy here? I mean, even with these fires, it's just like, you have to think, I mean, what have they been focusing on, I guess? And that is apparently not for me to know and not for the public to know. But Brian, do you have any clue as to where they are focusing their efforts right this minute?
No, that's not something that, the information flow is pretty much a one-way street from me to them. Right. So we'll track down, follow up on leads that we receive through our tip line, and then pass that along to them. Sometimes we collaborate on those, sometimes we don't. But they don't provide me any kind of situational awareness on what they're focused on or not.
Go ahead.
Let me just mention one thing, Lauren, and I suspect Brian may know more about this than I do. But one of the things that's come out lately is the ability to geofence phones. And what that means is you can basically request from the cell phone companies, the providers of which there really isn't that many anymore, right? To say, tell me every phone that was in this location on this date at this time. That is an incredibly powerful weapon if you have some idea of where the person was at a particularly critical time. And I have some familiarity with that in my professional life, but that is a really powerful tool. They don't give you the names of the people. They give you the phone numbers and say, these are the phones. And then you have to go track down each of those phones. But in DC, it's crazy to do, right? Because there's just so many phones, it wouldn't work. But in more rural areas and in larger areas like Reading, it is easier to do. Those are some of the types of things I would say, have you done that? Have you figured out, was this phone there? Maybe you don't have his phone, but it also gives you witnesses, right? If I am looking at all the phones in a particular area and I find one and it's a totally innocent person, but it's a witness, I may be able to go to that person and say, did you see anything that night? Did you see a truck? Did you see a car? That's an incredible new tool that's only been around at least the last 4 or 5 years. But that's the type of thing I'd be asking them. Is that what you're doing? Are you looking into that? And I don't know, Brian, if you can speak more to that, if you know more about it.
Yeah, certainly. We use that quite a bit, Tad, especially in teen runaway cases,
Right.
because the way that data works on a geofence, and forgive me if I don't get too technical here, but effectively any app downloaded on your phone submits these packets back up to a cloud. Okay, so there's a unique device ID associated with that, and effectively advertisers track you and follow you around during your day. What I will say is the primary thing is to build a pattern of life for that person physically, to say, I know that Jarrett Ferrantino lives here. This is where he goes to the gym. This is where he works, right? And now I can start to geofence those areas and see, triangulate. His phone was here. His phone was here. His phone was here. So now I can make an assumption that manufacturer's equipment ID that I get is actually the device that he's holding.
Yep.
So once I've established, hey, this is Nikki's phone, right? These are places that she's been. I know this is where her bed down location is. I've got a good pattern of life. Then I can backtrack and go into that. Now, it's not a perfect science, right? That has definitely led me personally and my staff, if they're listening to this, on a number of wild goose chases, for lack of a better term, where we spent days in surveillance on a condo complex not long ago in Florida, and we find out that we had the wrong phone. So it's certainly not a perfect science, but to your point, if a solid pattern of life is built, it can be a great tool.
Yep. Agreed. Fascinating, relatively new tool too.
There's a question here. And also I just want to add that I do understand, Brian, logically why they can't give you the entire case file. I guess my common sense just, I don't understand in that sense, because you could work the case that much better, and then the case could hopefully be solved and families could have closure, peace, or their loved one back. So I think that's where I struggle. It's like the whole thing, if you tell a priest that you murdered someone, they can't rat on you. It's just like, it's weird. It's like, I don't understand this. It's like, it doesn't make sense to me.
And to answer that question, more often than not, we're generalists as private investigators, right? When you have somebody who's a specialist, like Doug, like Tad, like Doug's team, that's where they're going to need to comb through every single piece. From our perspective, I would say 50% of the time, if I had to put a number on it, 50% of the time I'm getting some prescient information from law enforcement as to the direction of our efforts. And then the other 50% of the time, it's just like this, where it's a one-way road, which doesn't indicate cooperation at all. That's very common for us, that this is how it is.
Yeah. And I hope I didn't come across negative. I'm really not. I know how hard law enforcement works. I completely understand. I sympathize, but I sympathize with families more. And I just feel so frustrated and so heartbroken that it's almost like, but you don't know, but you think and it's like, but you can't do anything. So it just, it feels icky. It's just an icky feeling that all of this, you can't control it, right? You feel just not in control, and it's frustrating, at least in my eyes. Wow, I just silenced everyone. That
no, I think it's a silent agreement with what you said.
Yeah, no, right. I'm just looking through the chat. The chat was wild. I don't know what happened. I think we might need a moderator at this point, because I was going there and trying to do this. I was talking to Brian. I was like, Brian, help me. But you didn't. But anyway, if anyone, okay, there's one more question. Sorry. As a mobile phone is moving, the card inside of it does a handshake with the cell tower and will log all the subscriber info on the tower. Okay. Yeah. Once another tower, it goes, okay. That wasn't a question. Sorry.
And yeah, Kevin, that's a good synopsis. And that's separate to what Tad and I were talking about. That cell tower, cell site information. The geofence information is in addition to that.
Brian, I hope they have our guy's phone here. I mean,
I would,
which the geofence is still useful, but I mean, there's nothing better than the phone. I don't think they have Nikki's phone, but I think they have. I'm thinking they have our guy's phone here.
Yep.
And this might sound dumb, but like with everything on the cloud, I think she had an iPhone. I will confirm, but can't you just get access to her cloud and get all her data?
Assuming she backed it up on a cloud, that's the thing, Lauren. Like a lot of people don't have everything backed up on a cloud, so you may not be able to get. The phone is key. The phone has everything. So, but I mean, you make a good point. The cloud, like it's hard to say, but like if Tyler had, or if they have his phone, different.
Yeah. For example, I don't have anything backed up on the cloud. I have 1,000+ photos in my phone and none of them backed up, which I know I'm supposed to be doing someday. Maybe I'll do it after this.
I feel like I have an automatic backup. Do you not do that? Am I the smartest one in the room right now? Sorry, all your degrees can just shove it because
we're cautioned against doing that because it's subject to theft that way. But
wait, what do you mean?
They're not as secure if they're up there in the stratosphere. But
yeah, if it's on your phone, they have to get your phone.
It's safer on your phone. Yes.
I just feel like if something happens, I want my data.
Listen, I'm willing to sacrifice my precious memories to not hand them off to the Russian government.
You're like, F my kids when they were 2. Who cares? Like, yeah, I mean, my case info is on here. And actually, this is interesting, Kathy. I heard the same thing. There was a lot of burner phones used. Not sketchy at all. Like, who doesn't? Yeah, not sketchy at all.
Right.
Interesting.
Yeah, and that's where, to Tad's point on the geofence, that's where you can start to identify, those burner phones. You can identify different devices that are being held. If there's a common thing we see in criminal activity is folks using like a phoner app to create a voice over internet phone. And that's how you could actually locate one of those is using the geofence. So, I have to assume that that's something Shasta County has done and is doing. That's a pretty basic play to make here.
And I think too, our viewers and listeners are pretty up on this stuff, but I don't know. It's not I don't think it's the CAS system, but there is a process, particularly the federal government has in investigations, where they run almost like a circle of commonly dialed numbers, and they create these independent circles. It's like my cell phone number would call my wife and children. They would regularly call, their parents and a neighbor, and they build this circle of frequently called numbers and builds its own localized network along with the geofence. So, I mean, all of that stuff is so powerful when you're looking at that. I mean, that exists. What do you guys? Is there a name for that other than frequently called numbers?
Yeah, I don't know. There's a name for it, but that's one of the things I tell detectives because they can get overwhelmed with the amount of cell phone data. Start with who's called most frequently.
Right.
Start with who you have longer calls with, right? Because most of us, with our significant others, we don't have long calls with them, right? It's, okay, I'm on my way home. Can you pick something up at the grocery store? That's it. It's a 1-minute call. But if all of a sudden you're having a 5-minute call, on a cell phone now is like, oh, who's that? Who are you talking to? So those are the things I tell detectives, focus on those 2 areas, frequency and longer calls. And
right. You got something to say for 5 minutes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I pinned this comment because I think it's important to also clarify. I think the word or the term burner phone, I think it can be used in many different ways. It could be a phone number that you use, a Google number. It could be an old phone that, it could be really anything. So I think it depends, but Tad or Brian or Jared, if you could answer this about the tracking, but I do think
it's basically
gray.
a phone. So you have your phone that's assigned to you, and that's your common number that you give out to friends and family. And then you have, remember Breaking Bad, Walt had a second phone. It freaked Skylar out, right? I mean, because why do you have a second phone if it's not for work? It's because you're doing something or contacting, or you don't want your travel contacts or calls tracked. So a burner phone is something you could dump. You just throw it in the burner and it's gone. So people engaged in criminal activity often utilize, particularly drugs. Drug dealers, one of the factors you consider is how many phones are found with the drugs.
Yeah.
And it's tracked the same way, as far as I know. It's harder to track back to a person, of course, because of the way the phone may have originated. I may go buy 10 phones and then go, sell them to various people without that being tracked.
Right. Yeah, that helps. Well, is there any other questions in the chat before I go make sure my kids are sleeping? I only had one interruption tonight. It was kind of, it was weird. Only one. I expected more. But, well, Tad, this has been really, really eye-opening. I'm so grateful that you came on the show. We would love to have you back, and we would love for you to just kind of, if you don't mind, keep an eye on this case. So we
absolutely
can have you back.
Yep. Yeah. No, it's definitely one I've been following and will continue to follow. And thank you so much for having me on. It was nice to see, you two again, and nice to meet you, Jarrett.
Thank you, Ted. Likewise.
And Brian, thank you as always. We bother Brian so much. He's so patient. I wish you had better access to case files. That's because I know that you would kill it. I know that you could be doing so much more. And Brian, if there's anything you can do to sort of whisper in Shasta County's ear about Doug, I know everybody would be so grateful.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on, guys.
Thanks,
yeah,
Tad, great to see you again.
Great to see you, Brian. Take care.
All right,
good luck.
guys. Thanks so much. And I'm going to have the link to Tad's book in the episode notes. So go buy it and go to his website. Like Brian said, it's really fascinating.
Great.
Definitely.
Right. Well,
thanks again. Have a good night.
Bye.
Happening. You're trying to figure out ultimately what is
It's still a mystery as to why it took them